Yeah, one of the most important parts of this is like the recording and making the video. So then everybody can have access to this. So thank you very much, Lisa, for joining us.
Of course.
It's so good. I met Lisa, I think we met, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Lisa?
Yeah, it was maybe 2 years ago at George Washington University, where I've been in a couple of different roles. First as the National Geographic Visiting Professor of Science Communication, and then I visited for long enough where they invited me to be research professor with some of my funding as well. So I continue to write and report on these issues. Doing my own work in journalism and my own writing and research, but still affiliated to some degree with George Washington University. I have also other affiliations. I've also been recently named Global Fellow at the Wilson Center, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And so we'll continue to do that work, and recently received a Fulbright to continue some of these, this knowledge exchange at some other places. So I'll be, if all goes well, I'll be in a longer public policy Fulbright in Europe. So I'll be based in Europe, if fingers crossed, for the 2025-26. I guess, is that next year? Yeah, that academic year. Yeah. So I'll be collaborating with my former postdoc in the Netherlands, as well as be in Vienna, and then doing some other work just really on European and US policy.
That is absolutely amazing. I think we are very lucky to have you. So I think, Luis, do you think it's time to start, like, officially?
Yeah, I think we already have started, but let's make it official. Adela, you should make this official.
Okay, let's make it official. So welcome everybody to Gastronomy and Beyond. My name is Adela Valderas, myself, Luis Alonso from City Science Lab, and all the team will be hosting Gastronomy and Beyond. We are delighted to welcome everybody that will be listening to us to our third edition, Connecting the World. Luis.
Wow.
Yeah, good.
What happened? Oops, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. This is our third edition. So we are delighted to be your host together with España, MIT, RCC, Harvard, Basque Culinary Center, and of course, the great support of all the team at MIT. Once a month, we'll be together in our Gastronomy and Beyond. And Luis, ready to start? Should I introduce a little bit more of Lisa?
Oh yeah. No, I mean the first thing is like I think like I have to thank you, Adela, for making this happen. I mean, like this is the third edition of this kind of events where we are connecting, like gastronomy and beyond. I mean, like I always say like gastronomy and communities, gastronomy and culture. I mean, like I think this is super important. So thank you for making this happen. And I know every new season has always something cool and new. So thank you for bringing probably the most relevant people on the field like Lisa. So I don't know. I think you should introduce her. Yeah.
Okay, so we're delighted that this is happening, and we are delighted that Lisa is with us, journalist, author of Hot, Hungry Planet, with publications such as The Guardian, The New York Times, Slate Magazine, Scientific American, the Yale Forum, Fortune, and many others. Her writing also appears in academic media as well as research journals, including Nature, Climate Change. And we invite all of you to enjoy her talk, get inspired. Welcome to Gastronomy and Beyond. And Lisa, ready when you are.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Again, I'm just delighted to be here. I know that I'm a big fan of the work that you're doing, and so I hope to share a little bit about my background, just to begin to give you some of the context from my approach, as well as tell you about my journey kind of through this field and where it's come when I first started doing this specific line of research and reporting over 10 years ago. And then kind of how it's shifting today, kind of where I'm looking at some of the work, as well as some of my current collaborations, kind of to connect the dots as well. I'm going to, as I was playing there, I was trying to figure out my slide sharing, because when I slide share, somehow I don't see you. So if you don't, you'll have to interrupt me by saying, you know, your name. Like, I can't see you about if you're raising a hand. So please just interrupt and jump in if anything is unclear. But I want this to be a conversation. I have just a few slides just to give you a bit of my background and some talking points, and then I'll stop this slide share once you know, we proceed. So you'll have to let me know when you see my full slides as a share. I'm going to see if I can get it as slideshow. Oh, wait a minute. Cancel. Wait a minute. Presenter view. Okay, here we go. You should be able to see the whole thing, but let me know what you see, if you can see like the whole thing as.
No,
Do you see presenter view, or do you see
presenter view?
Okay, so let me do the different screen. Okay, sorry about that.
It's so good you're here with us.
Yeah.
And it's so meanwhile I'll keep talking, Lisa.
Yeah,
So
please do.
it's really fantastic that we have your perspective. Usually we have some chefs, we have completely different perspectives, and having yours, it really adds a lot of knowledge, and I'm sure you know, we'll make you a lot of questions. Oh, here we are.
Okay.
It's perfectly fine.
That's great. And actually, the way I just did this, I can see you as well. So just to introduce myself, you know, I am a journalist and author. I've been writing and reporting on some of these very complex socio-environmental issues for over 20 years. I just recently joined the Wilson Center as a global fellow. It's a research affiliation. I was previously at the Wilson Center when I was working on Hot, Hungry Planet as a public policy fellow during 2014 and 2015. So it was a one academic year fellowship with them. And so, and then I'm finishing out my research professor role at GW. So with my work here today, I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview. I'll be just telling you a little bit about myself. Oops. This way. And getting into my work with Hot, Hungry Planet, looking at sort of how I see the climate change, food security nexus, how that emerged for me and that in my work. Some of the research reporting and collaboration that I'm doing, I really want to stress that collaboration piece, because I'm really seeing that there is a need for less extractive journalism to be around the world. So I'll touch on that a bit. And then I also wanted to, you know, share with you what I've learned more about storytelling, digital media, and data provision in research, and then end on some of the socio-environmental synthesis and communication work that I see as of great value in this space. So about me, as Adela said, you know, I've written for a number of public-facing media around the world. And as well as a number of podcasts. I host a podcast here, the Environmental ECSP, the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. I can guest host a podcast there on the New Security Beat. So if you have any recommendations, or if you would like to have a discussion, I'm very interested in continuing to explore what that might mean for us together. But this is really when I'm out in the field, kind of what I'm doing. I'm interviewing, I'm capturing the stories. I'm also trying to be in the spaces where people are doing the work. This is a video and a written piece that I worked on around our sort of importing tropical plants. And so this is some of the research and reporting on that. So, you know, when I think about the work around climate change, food security, you know, think about this time in our lives where we're really being shaped in so many different ways by our rapidly changing and shifting both economic, environmental, political, and social dynamics. And so when I started my working on my book, I thought about these complexities and how could we capture this, and in an article, even in a research piece, you can only get a certain number of facets, but in stories, you can really bring the public, the reader, into the context and the ideas, and see them how they play out on the ground in real life. And so part of my work here was really starting to fact check and bring some life into this very dry research and analysis I was seeing being reported around how we really were not equipped to deal with an increasingly changing climate, as well as sort of what we're going to be doing to adapt and continue to feed this growing global population. In fact, I do a game in my classes when I teach this as a class. You may think about this too, because of a component of this for me has been understanding the role of population dynamics. And that has a lot to do with like where they are growing the most, what is the percentage of youth population versus elder population in a certain area, and what does that mean for the local context. So I start in my classes when I do this, and I do a presentation, I call it the grandma game, and I ask them like, who has the oldest living grandparent, and everybody raises their hand. Oh, I've got one, 85 or 91 or 99 or whatever. So I start to say, well, okay, if you live to be as old as the oldest grandparent, what year will it be? It's usually around 2100. So I start to think about in their lifetime, what their grandparents changed, like what changed, and then what will change for them. A lot of this really has to do with what the trajectories and what milestones we face in addressing climate change. And so I try to really make it as concrete as I can, because some of this abstraction is just too much, especially around food security. And so in response to some of this, I get into the field, and I've been capturing stories for people around the world. I traveled around the world, met with people, spent time on the ground in countries, far and wide, rural places, urban places, speaking with policymakers, speaking with people who are actually dealing with the work in the field. And, I found that, we know that the response to these complexities have really changed in over the past several decades. They've because of developed very ambitious targets for things like the Sustainable Development Goals, that again representing a big area that can track the progress. But we know that it's the SDGs are really they're not living up to what they're expected. I think, but there's a very small likelihood they will even achieve what these targets are. But one of the key interconnections in the SDGs is food. It's production, it's distribution, and it's security. And so I know that in that gastronomy and beyond sense, that is where we can come together on these ideas. And so in my own research on food security, and I know I've taken that look at as in a collaborative approach. I'm speaking with the farmers, the people who are actually growing in industrial agriculture, to understand and see where they're coming from, because it's creating that dialogue and being able to share some of their stories and concerns, what the adaptation limits are, and what do we need to do from here. And so my goal, both as in doing my own research and then telling the stories as a journalist and author, has been sort of to capture this holistic view on what it takes to ensure food security in a world of climate uncertainty. And so when I first started this work, it was not even something that was covered within the IPCC reports. The agriculture was a very small component of that, if it was even mentioned at all. Again, in the National Climate Assessment, they it was a small mention. Only recently has it become a full chapter, for instance, or having a full panel, having this area being covered, because it is a key component to what, for instance, the US produces in terms of crop production, exports to the world, but also understanding what are the responses and the resiliency. So here, in the upper right-hand corner is Susan McCooch. She's one of the people I interviewed for my book. She was doing some crossbreeding and research on modern rice strains, looking at what are some of the key traits in their wild ancestors of rice that can boost resilience. So for instance, they've been able to breed some of the traits of this rice that will outlast a heavy rainfall, because we know, for instance, in parts of South Asia, they're getting the entire monsoon's worth of rain in like 3 days. And so the crops are getting flooded. And, I went to India and I found and met with some of the people there that were looking at new ways of planting and growing rice that can adapt to these conditions. And this is looking at their wheat and rice rotation, how they can then, keep the stubble of the wheat in the field, not burn it off and causing all that heavy pollution, and then planting it between the rows, planting the rice in between the rows of wheat when they do that rotation. So some of these adjustments, they're calling it climate smart agriculture. There's a provision in the U.S. agricultural landscape now that is looking at with the Inflation Reduction Act, looking at the ways that we can have more climate smart agriculture in the U.S. But this is sort of places around the world are far ahead of this. They're really looking at this because their livelihoods are I guess they need to address this for their own livelihoods. And so like Susan McCooch was looking at this in terms of rice, so that in a deluge, rice can, for instance, I guess it's not necessarily her work, but other people have done this work where they can, it can, I guess, breathe. There's like snorkel rice. So there's a component of the rice that can float on the top of the water or hold its breath, for instance, to be able to grow and continue to live and not be, flooded out. So that has been a critical component to rice, as well as, for instance, looking at some of the wild traits, like, as we know, if you have a yard or a landscape where you see the weeds go crazy in summer, like crabgrass or whatever, in that hot weather, certain things grow fast. So we want to see what kind of traits that can be bred into things like rice that can really withstand that intense heat, or for instance, that intense rain. So we know that climate change is really water change. And so those are some of the stories that I captured in my book and in my research. I also, talked to ranchers in Minnesota and Iowa, who, for instance, had to sell their cattle prematurely because they were set up for some heat related losses. Like the cattle could not survive the heat stress. They had been going through a drought. There was not enough, was not enough ways to cool the cattle, so they had to take them to market, far sooner than they were ready. So farmers were receiving losses. And so, I wanted to meet the farm landscape where it was and report on where it was versus where, the world thinks it should be. And so that's kind of what I did with my work in Hot Hungry Planet. So we know today, as more extreme events from droughts and floods, like the stakes are even higher. And yet, when I first started, I found, like, seriously, the researchers and the policymakers were really kind of pulling out the hair because they weren't being included in these big conversations, but now they are. And so I've seen a shift in tone, and we know that the odds are being stacked against us with climate change, but it's also driving some creative solutions. And so, we know that agriculture adaptation can increase resilience to climate change. We know that various ways that climate change will disrupt food systems in very uneven ways. So just recognize it, that it's uneven, and that rural communities especially have crucial roles to play, but they're also at risk. And so having this challenge now to kind of harness some of the innovations and build resistance into our food systems, both ensuring that crop yields stay high, without further exacerbating a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve, like climate change. For instance, climate change itself. So this means like things like reducing or the amount of fertilizer that gets placed on fields, so there's not a lot of runoff. The fertilizer is also very heavy in emissions, and so how can we be more precise in that? So we are looking at, again, more robotic type of agriculture, very precise kinds of irrigation systems. And so these are the kind of the rural landscape innovations that I'm seeing. As well, it's like the purchasing pipeline is changing. I'll talk a little bit about that later, maybe during our Q&A. But I know that with the climate change, the various patterns in rainfall, the rising temperatures and declining soil moisture, it's increasingly been disrupting our food systems and production. And so in my book, I reported in different places around the world where they were at sort of a decision point. So hold on a second. So just backing up here, I thought I had a slide on this, but I don't. I missed it putting in there. But for instance, when I went to Colombia, they were having it was either, I can't remember if it's an El Nino or a La Nina. They were having, it's in that lower, that oscillation that we have in the Pacific, where they were having extended period of drought. And so there are areas that would typically plant rice, but without enough natural rainfall and further exacerbated by a lot of drought, they realized that the best decision they made was just to not plant the rice at all, because they saved their seeds. They didn't have a lot of investment there, so they realized that they weren't going to lose money. So these are some of the actual decisions that farmers are making right now around the world, is whether or not they will proceed in a certain course of their business, and that further has implications on reduced food supply. So these are the decisions that people are making right in their own backyards. Other places like where maybe women are leading, they're the lead producers in parts of Africa, or even in some places in Latin America, they are getting more access to credit or to loans, so that they can then make those improvements on their farm and adaptations on their farm, where they might not have had access to credit or bank accounts or funding before because of their gender. So gender equity is improving in some places, not all. There are still places where it's very inequitable, and that is something that definitely needs to be addressed. I also will mention that I'll report as well on something I didn't anticipate with sort of this food security and climate change, was the role of women's empowerment around the world to be able to, have things like access to credit, access to finish their high school education, their ability to plan and space the births of their children so that they can have more of time to be able to run their household and families in a more sustainable way. So, these are some things that I touched on in my book that, again, as the research was unfolding in the field, they had to be included, because to leave them out meant there would be a lot of blind spots in the book. And that's, I guess, one of the benefits of writing a book, is that you can include some of these richer level stories in there. And so I also want to mention there, I've continued this work. Again, this is just a brief overview of some of the work that I've done, but in my research on food security and climate change, I've been really particularly interested in sort of the work that you're doing, the art and practice of food and its role in our society and the role in our culture, and what chefs can do, and how this intersects with some broader issues. You know, food is more than sustenance, it's social, it's cultural, and it's an economic force. And so really by understanding that and how it can contribute to sustainable development, you know, I felt that this is something very rich for me to continue reporting on. So let's see. I realize my time. I want to make sure that we have enough time for our discussion. But you know, we're really seeing a big shift in the U.S. To some just building up more resilience. I know the Department of Agriculture has and is starting to invest, has earmarked about $3 billion right now in towards climate smart agriculture, with 60,000 farms and maybe 25 million acres of land in the US. I mean, that's a lot, you know, and for the US to start doing this, it's whether it's carbon sequestering practices like cover cropping and improved nutrient management. And we know that also some private sector partners have a lot to do with this. Places like, you know, regenerative grazing, cover cropping, these can, you know, further reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also recognizing that the agriculture industry has, you know, is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, because moving forward into this work I've been doing with the work with Johan Rockström and Peter Schlosser, you know, I was invited to work with them for the last couple of years during Climate Week. They had part of the Global Futures Conference. With them, they've been outlining the 10 must-haves and must-dos, you know, including among one of their 10 must-haves is the specific statement: we must have a safe and secure food for the global population. And so what do we must do? We must increase that sustainable development focus of our work. So sort of looking at what does that mean? It's now like teasing out what are the tactics that we can do from there. So this is, again, making sure that we have a direction to go so we can align with this work as it, I guess, and just really moves forward in these interconnected challenges. Let's see. I just wanted to move forward on this. Another one of my collaborations since writing my book has been working with Conservation X Labs in the Extinction Solutions Index. So, you know, we know that the world's nations are woefully lagging behind meeting targets toward, you know, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And as well, we are lagging behind in reducing the amount of species extinctions globally. And so what does that mean about, you know, extinction solutions? Well, you know, when we have such a disruption in our populations of species globally, we can have things like, you know, viruses and pathogens enter into our food systems. And, you know, as we've seen with like the avian flu and other kinds of, you know, diseases that can enter our food system. This is an area I think that is just beginning to emerge into more of a public realm for policy discussions. And as a, you know, there will be an increased interest, I believe, and there should be, on sort of the goal of making sure we can maintain crop yields to meet further adverse conditions without, at the same time, without decreasing the species that are important to our global food systems. And then the final piece here, and this is not me, it's my colleague Dina Seidel at Rutgers. You know, I'm working more on a collaboration, again, with people that I've been working with in the past on finding rich ways for storytelling, digital media to be paired with some of the research. So her work as and with colleagues is starting to examine what can be parts of the data provision in academic research and field research that can then be used by storytellers like myself or journalists like myself as part of the data sharing and data provision of research. And yeah, I included in the end here some of a link to some of her research on this. And I see that as a potential way for us to move from only academic storytelling in this area to more broader public storytelling that can help show the complete picture of this work. That can go from looking at something on the ground in a faraway place, and even if it's modeling or systems analysis, but having that data, that provision of media, whether it's video or photography, to then help to share and start connecting that to public audiences. As well, the socio-environmental synthesis communication, I was previous to George Washington University, I was a senior fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. It was a standalone center funded by the National Science Foundation that brought together research teams globally from around the world. I think they were active for about 10 years. I was with them for 5 years. And so they're just wrapping up, but they have a lot of great resources, information on how to tell these stories and these bigger stories. And I realized I didn't include the link to that, but it's sesync.org. I'll put it in the chat. It's SESYNC.org. I think it's .org. And they have videos, they have lectures, they have explainers. And so I think telling these stories and keeping the complexity that humans are part of the problem, humans are part of the solution as well. And that, the more that we can center this conversation on decisions that we make ourselves, as well as decisions that are made in our communities, we can start to connect the dots of all of the elements that add up to a more sustainable, food supply and sustainable food choices in the future. So again, in that decade since I first began exploring food security around the world, the impact of climate on food supply chain has really increased, and my perspective has changed, and we now better understand what's at stake. And I've just really noticed that people are working in this realm in really interesting ways. Like one example here is the sweet story of Peru's blueberry boom. This comes to us from The Economist, not my work, but it has, and I will add the link to that in the chat as well, because it's not in my references, I realize. But I put this here because it talks about how different places around the world are adapting to, how this here is talking about federally subsidized irrigation on arid land, like more desert style land, that they created as blueberry fields, where they then export to blueberries around the world. As we know, we're eating not always in season. So this is really interesting in how these farmers have transformed the market in 10 years. And a 10 years time span is really important here because there are big 2030, there's a big focus on 2030 as being a big change time frame for achieving our targets on global greenhouse gas reductions. And so what does this mean, in places like Peru that are doing this important work of transforming their economy and putting together new food systems, but also what does that mean for other places? And so what can we learn from this, from the positive, but also where can we be cautious? And so I see this as, again, one of those aspects where we can learn and study and not just look at it as a simple story, but look at it from all of the complexities. And so this is my email, and I will share that with you, but I will share with you my reference, I guess. So, finally, I just kind of wanted to wrap this up by saying that this, as we really know now and we have a better understanding what's at stake, I've noticed that people are much more focused on these innovations, these shifts that are needed. There are less unnerved by the complexity and the trouble that they see ahead. People are much more serious. They're more deeply focused on, again, this innovation needed in food production, but also along the pipeline, working more with chefs. I don't know if you know the work of Catherine Miller at the table, again, Chef's Guide to Advocacy, looking and partnering with local communities and chef, what is available. Some of the greatest stories I reported in my book, but also some of my other writing had to do with like some more institutional food service industry folks who are thinking, okay, where's the waste in the stream? How can we use the waste in the stream to make really nutritional food for our communities? And that had to do with being okay with buying smaller pieces or what would normally be lost. And there's probably a specific name for it. Like, for instance, in with salmon production, like there's parts of the salmon that aren't going to be ending up in Whole Foods. They're maybe the secondary market for this, but they were perfect for creating salmon burgers or salmon kind of things for food industry, or putting salmon in various pasta dishes where it's not needed to have an entire fillet. Really being creative. There's so much waste in the system, and that's another component as well. That these are the kinds of innovations that people are really starting to think seriously. It's not necessarily something that people want, that companies want to say, yeah, we're really looking at how we can use the secondary product there, but that should be more acceptable and be have more sort of, I guess, value placed on that kind of innovation. So, as agriculture is changing, our choices are changing, and this change is far-reaching, and it ends up on our plates. I'll close today and share with you, and I think one of the really touching pieces in my career that I wrote, it was I could probably find it here because these are not my photos, so I didn't include it in this is this slideshow. I usually try to get somebody's I tried to get permission before this, but I didn't get the permission to use his photos in here. But I worked with Chris DeBode. I'm going to just do another screen share here and show you this because I can use it on a screen share. So I worked with Chris DeBode. He's a photographer based now I think in Switzerland, but he did some really beautiful, I think you can see this. Can you see the image of a bowl on a plate?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Yeah. So he wrote he did this photo essay. And this was really touching to me because this was in northern Cameroon. And it was about Lake Chad, as Lake Chad was really has been really drying up. But he did this photo essay kind of on one meal a day, what an entire family shares on one meal a day, and putting it in the context of plates. Again, having the stick of maize, with people being displaced in their homes, with conflict, with the seeds that people carried with them to grow, what vessels they brought with them to carry and share. The cereal, this is like a cereal, this emergency food that refugees are eating as proteins. Again, this few grains of rice and some beans, again, the grains being in very short supply, and what the sort of the small tomato was available to them, and what people were eating on their food. Again, whenever as a storyteller, I can bring it down to some very specific levels that we can all identify with. And it's also you're, taking pictures of a plate, kind of like that Instagram thing that we do as, humans in the world, sharing pictures of a meal that we have, but doing it in that way and sharing what that image is versus having a picture of people in need. Again, very extractive type of journalism, where you are kind of sharing a different power dynamic, showing a human in struggling. There are certain values, I think, to having us have that human connection, even seeing what another community is eating or not eating, sharing with their family and the decisions they're having to make. So as a storyteller, I guess to bring it together at the end, I really try to find these ways of connecting through story, not, and as much as possible, not being extractive in my storytelling, meaning I want to make sure that if I'm going to bring somebody into the story, it's for a reason, so that the world can see that it can, their story can illuminate a larger subject versus, just bringing them in for the storytelling sake as well. There has to be a real reason for their story to be told, and then providing them with the voice and access to the story afterwards, and having, again, and staying in touch with them, seeing how they're doing, checking on them. So as I report on stories from around the world, I really try to stay in touch with the people I've communicated with over time, and if possible, provide updates on the stories that they shared with me previously. So I realized I went longer than I had hoped. I want to entertain your questions. Again, I can share my email and these links and share my slides with you if that's of interest. But I would love to hear what you're working on, and what points that you're working on could resonate with this work as well.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed. I think it was absolutely fantastic listening to you. We are, as you mentioned, it's a complex conversation, and it's a complex world. And I love the way you also mentioned this population aging, that is gonna, you made all this together, and it's extremely, extremely interesting. Before, I think probably Luis will guide us through some questions, but let me just read something. In the description of the book, of your book, there are some data. The United Nations predicts the Earth will have more than 9.6 billion people by 2050, with resources already scarce. How will we feed them all? So listening to what you're doing, traveling all over the world, trying to look perhaps for answers and for hope is absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Luis, probably will have questions, yes?
No, yeah, I mean, you are doing so much. So thank you very much. And I think it is like a perspective of a lot of elements that there, as Adela was saying, it is not a simple system. It's a super complex system, and you have been touching all of the elements. I mean, in the group, we are just starting to explore this concept of gastronomy and beyond, and communities. But every time that we talk with chefs, they are talking about things that you were mentioning about how to build communities around the food, so you can have the production in a local way, but also you can empower people. You were talking about empowering females in around the planet. I think that's super valuable, super important, and also it's very important the concept where you were talking about. I mean, I think you have give a very optimistic kind of talk, which I love it, because I had a very pessimistic kind of when I look into this issue, because I see the like huge corporations getting power on terms of food, like huge, like farmers, they are becoming more and more technologically and extracting more, and but then you are really pointing out into the hope, and saying, hey, no, there are people really embracing this new way of harvesting. That it was Gabi, that she's one of the researchers in the group from Brazil. She was pointing out that in the Amazonia, people are doing that since I mean, since the beginning, since thousands of years, where they were like planting. They don't only plant one type of plant; they plant the ecosystem around the plant, even the bugs, etc. So you are kind of growing, but then on the other side, for instance, in Europe, you have, I mean, this is my pessimistic side, where the farmers actually they went on a strike, and they were complaining last year, and they changed. I think Europe had a very nice law about trying to be more sustainable, and not because of the farmers were complaining, because they were like, okay, it's a not very fair competition between us, that we are following the rules, and other countries that they are not following the rules, and then the European Union is buying the tomatoes from whatever a country that doesn't follow the rules, instead of buying the local product. So one thing that is important is, you were talking about how can we engage with the farmers so they embrace this more like natural, well, natural, more. I like it how you say smart climate agriculture. So
Right,
how
right.
we can embrace this. So I don't know if there is a solution, or probably there is not a solution, but how can we embrace the smart climate agriculture, and at the same time people realize that that this is good for, farmers don't lose money because of the competition, etc. So I think it's a huge problem over there that
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, because I went to, for instance, I went to Colombia, and I went to Colombia as well. So the example I'm just about to say is, it was in India, northern India, actually, thinking about the farmer didn't sleep he told me, I didn't sleep for 2 solid weeks, because they had just had 2 weeks or 3 days of rainfall, which was flooding completely their field. And they thought it was going to be waterlogged. They had just planted their rice in the plant. And then he thought, oh, this is not going to work. But where his neighbor's farm hadn't used this system where where it had like the wheat stubble, which had more soil, provided more soil moisture and texture into the soil, and allowed the water to kind of flow through more organic material. His crop survived and the neighbors didn't. But he had been, it was funny because there was no way for me to really report on this very well, but he said, another gentleman told me his wife wouldn't feed him for like almost a week. At the end of the last season, she's like, you're being lazy. You go out and like clean up that field. He's like, no, we're supposed to not harvest or burn the stubble. So they realized they needed to actually have more communication to the women. So it's actually, women do have a lot of power in some of these farming systems, but it was like he knew the change, because I think it was probably what his grandfather did, and he was an elder and he was farming with his son. But he knew that his family had been through some serious famines. And he's also had lived through the Green Revolution. But he knew that adaptation was really needed, because what he was seeing was something that has been so different from the rest of his life. But he was still very nervous until he saw it work himself. So it's having that knowledge sharing component. These are small shifts that can be made, but we know that there are changes that can be made in a lot of different places. I know even in the U.S., having our shift where we are enabling more of a planetary health diet for all, having a more healthy food system, shifting consumer behavior towards healthier and more sustainable diets, and having more public awareness campaigns of that, with nutritional education and policies that make it a plant-forward or plant-based sustainable options more accessible. We know that we can't have, just in terms of our land right now, that's, our plant and animal food production systems, don't necessarily line up with consumer needs, but increasing some of that sustainable development in the agriculture sector will also be an important aspect. I think that the Bezos Earth Fund, for instance, I think I just started a greenhouse, I guess, I think it's like a cattle. You may have heard of this, and I'm drawing a blank. They just started a project on like one of these prizes that will see about if they can reduce greenhouse methane emissions from cattle. is there a way for us to breed cattle with fewer methane emissions, for example? And, I'm just sharing this as, looking at ways to promote more innovations are in this sector. Do we know exactly what resource efficiencies can be made? And we know that just beef take so much water, they add so much greenhouse gas emissions into the system. And so what are some of the agroecological and regenerative farming practices that can ensure a more long-term environmental sustainability in that sector? There's so much to that. There's so much improvements that can be made that can be small shifts even. And, hopefully that answered some of the points that you raised.
No, totally. And we have made this research about carbon footprint. I mean, Alex, one researcher in the group, she has been real down on food actually, and what is the environmental impact of food. And in the United States is kind of a lot because it's very meat-based kind of food. So if you just shift into more vegetarian or vegan, let's say, behavior, you can reduce a lot of the environmental impact. So it's not only like figuring out how can we have cows that doesn't produce methane. maybe it's also like thinking about maybe we can have a different diet, like Mediterranean diet that is more diverse, or vegetarian diets, or even vegan. So I think it's like again, it's not technology. That's why I like it a lot, the smart climate agriculture, because it's not about deploying sensors and understanding. No, it's about understanding nature and reusing the mechanisms from nature so we can plant in a more efficient way. So I think that's very smart. and I think
I think that there's also that the way, we can think about it as the innovations, but it's also the responses and solutions. They don't have to be tech. It's not all tech. It's sometimes it's looking back, like, in your colleagues in Brazil, it's like looking at from time immemorial, what systems work together to ensure kind of these responsible agricultural practices can happen in a system.
No, I have thousands of questions, but I don't know if in the group, like Marcus, Maggie, somebody, or Federico, like.
Yeah, hi, Lisa. So I'm here with a group of folks. I'll pass it if others have questions. I heard you briefly mention the SDGs, and I believe you said, I think those benchmarks are really important for us internationally, but I think you mentioned that maybe they're not doing enough. So I'm curious to hear what more could be done or what you think is missing. And also if there are any other of those interesting connections of like women's health and food or equity or those other places where.
Yeah, it's funny because like that has since writing my book, and I'm looking here because I have, you may see I've got books everywhere. But the work that Ayanna Johnson or and others have done. Here it is. And All We Can Save, has this. If you've seen this, it really brings together a lot of the interconnections. And so when I first started writing the book, I wasn't, first of all, aware of that work, of the real social science interconnections of like women's empowerment, access to family planning, planetary health, those interconnections with, and even access to markets and what roles people have. I wasn't aware of some of these things. And so in my reporting, I found them and I had to include them in the book because I felt that they were not, it's important for me because they were not being covered in other aspects. I felt that people were very much focused on, vegetarian diets. Well, like that's fine for us here in the US, but there are places around the world that just want, they just want to eat more than millet, or they just want to have their first access or some protein of some kind of healthier diet, more sustainable, healthier diet. And I found that things like, for instance, land tenure, like their ability for a woman to inherit her, like if her husband dies, she should be able to have, you know, access to the land. But then in some places, you know, she doesn't have the right to hold land title. And so there's been a big effort toward that. There's been a big effort towards bringing more education toward female producers. For instance, in my book, I covered some of the work of a rural university for women in Uganda. And they wanted to start this university, but they didn't actually have enough girls graduating from high school yet. So they had to start there and kind of like looking at the pipeline of how they could make sure they could get girls through there. But rather than educate them and bring them and, you know, to become, I'm just making like doing a job that would force them to go to a city to be able to get their degree is for one thing, and they have to maybe go to a city to be finance or accounting or, you know, something like that. They actually, their majors are being more rural extension agents. And so part of their work is to be communicators on a radio show. And so in their, at least for the high school component of this, they had to take, you know, certain entrance exams, but they also had to do an oral storytelling exam because they had to, as part of their work, had that rural extension agent component, being able to talk to other women and sharing best practices and knowledge. So these are the kinds of things that I hadn't even thought of as part of this concept. But of course, when you're out in the field and listening to people, this is, you know, what they tell you. Other places that I traveled to and learned from were doing things like having access to solar energy to pump water to irrigate their field. And it was a way, again, to do it because otherwise they would use diesel fuel and they would have diesel pumps and and it was costly. So they were able to experiment on ways that they can use solar energy to pump, and it also they could sell extra solar energy back to the grid and have kind of another crop from that, or, you know, another sort of line of income from that solar energy. It was meant to reduce overpumping of water because they're reducing a lot of groundwater. This is in Gujarat state in India. So again, it's looking at some of these ways that you're looking at what's the energy and water connection, what's the access to women's health, and the population dynamics in certain areas. We know, for instance, that Ethiopia will very soon be, you know, has one of the larger populations of in the world in terms of its global, you know, it's how it ranks up in global population. And, you know, they're tracking, again, just because how land tenure is passed down, how it's divided, and more people are moving to cities because they're having fewer opportunities in rural areas to raise crops and support their families. So they're having to adjust to that. And so tracking that and telling that story has been really interesting to me to see and hear. Another component I did talk about, and I see we've hit time already. I don't want to go overboard, but it really resonated with me because I wanted to make sure I was sharing it in a way that was valuable without it sounding like I was coming from an area of judgment. But there is a story in my book that has to do about Jiboya, which is really women kind of selling their bodies in order to have access to the first shipment of fish into a fishing village. So there was the fishermen were coming back with such few catch that the women are the one who sell the fish at the market. But to be able to be the first in line for the catch to get like so that you've got a full vendor supply of fish to sell, the women were sleeping with the fishermen to be able to get that exchange for fish. And it's known as sex for fish. That's not what I was thinking of and I was reporting on the book, but this is a really important story to tell because it also contributes to their health. It's a really high amount of AIDS in this region. And so it was causing, disease in areas that people weren't expecting it to have a disease transfer. So again, these are very complex systems and communities, cultural traditions. And, when something like food security is involved, other problems and issues emerge that you might not otherwise, consider.
Absolutely. I think Marcus has the question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have one quick question. Like in our work and research in the group, we're trying to there's this issue around CO2 and climate change and, sustainability, for lack of a better word. And then there's all of these social mores or social issues that get kind of like roped in or woven into this fabric, into this discussion. And I think part of the problem as researchers we have is that if we're trying to solve social problems, is the vector through the agro industry, which is incredibly important for livelihood. I think it's raised the bar of how important it is today. Like 30, 40 years ago, there was the ability for populations to be kind of more sustainable or self-sustaining, where that's not the case anymore. I mean, a country that I'm very familiar with, Egypt, imports 60% of their food, and their population is still 60% agrarian.
Right.
So it's total mix match, right? So it's a double burden, right? I mean, it's like, you've got a population which can't move out of poverty, and you're also importing most of the food into the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of feel like at some point, the European model of saying we're going to finance or subsidize all of the farmers is the going trend globally that's being kind of like adopted. It's romantic, right? I mean, the French farmer in Bordeaux, lovely, but not really sustainable from a the rest of the world. And I'm always caught between, do you say, let's try to keep the agrarian farmer in Egypt agrarian and support their effort to be, or do you try to move society out of an agrarian economy towards something that's more realistic to be part of the 21st century, global sphere? And it's a constant fight, right? Between
that's a great question. I think from what I can, and you have more to say, I'm sure. And happy to follow up, and I would love to follow up on this conversation with you. I do have a chapter in my book, and I don't want to keep pointing my book, but I just wanted to tell you my reference of where I'm coming from, because I wrote The Tale of Two Droughts, and I compare Syria, the drought in Syria, and the same time frame with the drought in California. The 2013 or 12 to 14, 15 timeframe. But, what really happened then, and the two very different outcomes there. But I talk a bit about Egypt there and that whole change, again, with the wheat and how valuable and the culture of bread, like what it means that have the wheat production and the kind of wheat and how much is then now, of course, Ukraine, and how much wheat in Egypt is required for that pathway. But what's really important to understand, and kind of what you reference a little bit, is the social safety net that California has, or what Europe is looking at. Yeah, and it's money. But it's it's social safety net, but it's also, and I've done this in my research and storytelling around urban agriculture, for instance. It's not necessarily in urban systems as much about as growing plants, but like making sure that you have that person to call when you have an issue, and you have somebody to connect with, that maybe if you lived in a rural area, you had that network set up, and the networks of people helping each other to create like those mini safety nets. So, I think that there's something to be said about a bit in between. One of my interviews recently, it wasn't exactly to do with this, and I will also send this to you. I'll update my publication list here, because I'll send it to you. I did an interview with UN, is it UN, like a UN development person in the South, and there's an acronym I'm blanking on right now, but he was talking about the exchange for the least developed countries and having more of their kind of the value added taking place in their own country. And so, and then being able to export it there. So similarly, I see that as like that pathway for for rural areas where you may have agrarian, but then you have more value added that can be more in that localized space. I
That's
did
a
see that and
technology,
visited
right?
that. Yeah.
I mean,
What's that?
That's a technology. I mean, ultimately,
exactly.
a new crop in and a new way of growing. It's education, it's technology, it's evolving out of your
Right.
cultural kind of more, your cultural baseline.
Right. But we know like as populations grow, we know cities are growing bigger, but rural areas are also increasing in their population. So
Yeah,
it's, you know,
yeah,
and then we
absolutely.
still have the same amount of land. So how can we,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Or less.
Yeah,
or less in
absolutely.
Federico?
I think we're running out of time, Federico. Yes, very, very, very quickly.
I'll try. No, I'll try, but let's say I'll try to challenge Lisa on what are you expecting to find here in Europe? Because something I was really shocked from being European was the fact that we were exposed to food chains being used as weapons in the last 2 years. We saw that in Ukraine, we saw that in Israel and Palestine this year. And connecting to the question that Marcus was asking, is there a connection between our food development model and the resilience of territories, the resilience of communities, and also the capacity of communities and territories to be resilient in moments of shocks like wars or even climate shocks and things like that?
Yeah. We just have a few seconds, Lisa. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Really. I mean, that's a really interesting. I didn't hear what you said. Food chains exposed to what shocks?
No, being used like weapons, like army.
Oh, weapons. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, I was just looking at a book here. I think I'm using it as a prop. There's another colleague of mine who writes conflict cuisine. So on gastrodiplomacy, conflict cuisine, it's absolutely being used as a weapon of war. And how can we be more resilient to them? I think that's where, for instance, I was just at a book launch last night on climate violence, and what we're seeing is there's a connection, and this gets back to the population and the social side. There's a connection between having thought leaders, having elders with a strong connection to young people who can start to be, having that dialogue of being sort of moderate the conversations versus to increase resilience versus having a kind of a gap there that can allow sort of nefarious actors to move in.
That was so interesting, Federico. That was a fantastic question.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another conversation. I think we really have to thank you. I loved something you said. Humans are part of the problems. Humans are part of the solution. Thank you so much, Lisa. Yes, Luis, we're happy.
Yep.
I
think we have to repeat.
I know. Well, I'm absolutely would love to find a way to collaborate with you. I'm Federico. I'm having I have a research collaboration with one of my colleagues who's actually Italian, but now at Free University Amsterdam, working on the subject of water and communities. His work is the New Wave, and so if you wanted to look at Gianpel Dell'Angelo, so he's an associate professor at Free University Amsterdam. Happy to connect you, looking at kind of these water governance questions, but actually communities and pastoralists are one of his areas of interest.
Thank you very much indeed. You are part of our community, Gastronomy and Beyond, so we will find a way. Thank you very much indeed.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.